I would like to acknowledge the generous sponsors of African American art in the 20th century. The exhibition is organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The CF Foundation in Atlanta supports the museum's traveling exhibition program, Treasures to Go. The William R. Kennan Jr. Endowment Fund provided financial support. The Wichita presentation of the exhibition has been generously underwritten by presenting sponsors Koch Family Foundation and Emprise Bank. Generous support has been provided by Louise Beren, Berry Foundation, DeVore Foundation, Sharon and Alan Feary, Sonia Gredeman and Chris Brunner, Gridley Family Foundation, Kristen and Will Price, and Julie and Bill Nicholson. 2021 exhibitions and public programs are generously supported by the Downing Foundation. And of course, all museum exhibitions receive generous sponsorship from the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum and the City of Wichita. Tonight's speaker, and there she is, hi Connie, is Dr. Connie Choi. Dr. Choi is an expert on African American art and has her BA from Yale University, an MA from Harvard University, and her PhD from Columbia, where she wrote a dissertation on African American photography. In 2017, Dr. Choi joined the staff of the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she has organized exhibitions including Black Refractions and Their Own Harlems. Prior to joining the staff at the Studio Museum, Dr. Choi was an assistant curator of American art at the Brooklyn Museum, and prior to that, worked as a research assistant or curatorial intern at the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and National Gallery of Art. A recipient of numerous awards and honors, she's also published on African American photography, artist Brenny Youngblood and Kehinde Wiley, and Black women artists of Spiral. Most recently, she published Benny Andrews and a Contemporary Black Figurative Tradition for the exhibition Benny Andrews Portraits, A Real Person Before the Eyes, which closed last month at the Michael Rosenfeld Gallery in New York City. Tonight, she will speak to us about Benny Andrews' life and work. Benny Andrews has long been a Wichita favorite. In 1977, Andrews was a visiting artist at the Ulrich Museum of Art, and the Ulrich subsequently bought his mural Symbols. In 1991, Andrews returned to Wichita when WAM hosted the exhibition Folk, The Art of Benny and George Andrews, which featured the work of both Benny Andrews and his father. After the show closed, WAM purchased the painting Viola Andrews, which is currently on view in the permanent collection, and Mr. Andrews gifted us Where All the Rows Meet and Trick Shot at the same time. Both of those works will be on view in an exhibition opening March 13th. 30 years after his visit, WAM staff still speak about his humor, kindness, and intelligence. Tonight, Dr. Choi will help us dive deeper into Andrews' career as an artist, activist, and educator. And she's happy to take questions after the talk. You can just enter them into the chat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Choi to our screens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the invitation to be here with all of you tonight to talk about Benny Andrews, who's been a longtime favorite of mine and someone that I'm deeply interested in, especially given all the close ties he has to the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I currently work. So I'm going to be showing you a presentation, and I will share my screen now. So you'll have to indulge me with this talk as I've largely structured it around a work in the Studio Museum's collection, which you see here. I'm going to be talking about this monumental painting in the museum's collection, which is called Trash, to discuss various aspects of Benny Andrews' practice, interest and commitment to social justice. By honing in on details within this work, I will explore Andrews' 50-year career as an artist, as well as the many decades he spent as an educator and an activist, to bring to the fore some of the major contributions he made to the larger field of art history and to advancements in equitable practices for artists of African descent within museums and other cultural institutions. The works currently on view at and in the collection of the Wichita Art Museum will also feature prominently throughout the talk. And I hope you'll be able to then see those works in person if you haven't already. And I'm really glad that those two other works that Tara spoke about will be on view at the museum shortly. So to begin, Trash is part of the Bicentennial Series, a 6-year series begun in 1970, with each year focused on the production of one monumental painting, which you see here. It's as a preemptive response to what Andrews accurately predicted would be the exclusion of African American history and culture from the 1976 US bicentennial celebrations. Trash, the 12-panel large-scale work that came out of the second sub-series in the cycle, or which is the one that he worked on throughout the year 1971, shows the artist's personal perspectives on the nation's history, with references to the Ku Klux Klan, the Vietnam War, patriotism, incarceration, and labor, among other themes. Here you can see 3 Black men laboriously pulling a seamlessly endless caravan of representations of societal ills, or trash, to a dumping ground on the right side of the canvas. For the sake of time, and because I'm supposed to be discussing works on view at Wichita, we're not going to get into most of the content of the work. However, I'll be using it as a jumping off point, and several of the figures here, like chapter headings almost, because, and I'm probably biased given all the time that I've spent thinking about this work, but I see so much of Andrews's urgent artistic and social preoccupations represented in the painting, as well as a way to think through the past in all its often ugliness, as we know, but also make space for the continued and necessary relevant conversations in our present. Over the course of this 6-year series, Andrews created hundreds of pen and ink drawings and oil studies, working through his ideas and themes toward the creation of monumental works, including this one. His dedication to the creation of the Bicentennial Series was not unusual for him. He had long committed himself to calling out and raising awareness about discriminatory practices in the art world and beyond, and served throughout his career as an advocate for the greater visibility of artists of color. So you see here a detail of Andrews's representation of Lady Liberty. Gone is the heroic, triumphant representation embodied by the Statue of Liberty, which had for almost a century at that time served as a symbol of freedom, of welcome, and of progress. Instead, we have a barefoot Lady Liberty sitting somewhat casually on a phallic stump, indulging in a giant lollipop. She is surrounded by trash. We see empty cans, discarded boxes, and other detritus, but seems to take no notice or have a care in the world. Instead, she casts a long shadow over the scene, hinting perhaps at the reach of a prejudiced and unjust system over society. Andrews represents Lady Liberty here as deceptively innocent, her long blonde hair, the lollipop, and her bare feet lending an almost childlike quality to the figure. However, her crown, with its elongated, pointed spokes, and the way in which the flames from her torch seem to leap downward, dangerously close to the flammable trash below, offer a more cautionary tale. Andrews uses the immediately recognizable iconography of Lady Liberty to encourage viewers to think more critically about the state of freedom and progress in the United States. As a Black man raised in the Jim Crow South, in the second quarter of the 20th century, he was deeply aware of the inequities and injustices prevalent in the country. So to give a little bit of background on Andrews, he spent some time in the Air Force. He served honorably for the duration of the Korean War, and then after that used funding from the GI Bill to enroll in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He moved to New York City after graduating in 1958 and quickly immersed himself in the artistic community there. Within a decade of arriving in New York, he was one of the city's leading advocates for cultural change. The 1960s, which we all know was the height of the civil rights movement, were a time of social and political upheaval that extended far into the art world. With a growing recognition and demand for social justice, artists took on the work, and often the very hard work, of challenging the status quo. In October 1968, the Whitney Museum of American Art opened an exhibition celebrating the work of painters and sculptors in the 1930s. That show, which included over 80 artists, notably did not include a single Black artist, a huge oversight, especially given that the Harlem Renaissance, a period of great cultural production across the arts by African Americans, spanned the 1920s and 1930s. Andrews and other artists and cultural figures, including the artist Faith Ringgold and Henry Ghent, picketed the Whitney show and organized a counter exhibition, which is called Invisible Americans, Black Artists of the 30s, which actually opened at the Studio Museum in Harlem just a month later. The exhibition rejected the dominant art historical narrative that excluded Black artists, instead offering a counter history that celebrated the contributions of Black artistic production from 3 decades earlier. And here I'm showing you the exhibition announcement for that show, and you might be able to see some of artists' names that you recognize on the bottom there. Much like the work Andrews did with his fellow activists to quickly organize the Invisible Americans exhibition within a month of the Whitney show opening, artists throughout New York City joined together, formally and informally, to support one another and campaign for change, creating artist collectives and organizations that really ran the gamut. One activist group, the Black Emergency Cultural Council, or the BECC, was formed directly in response to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's controversial 1969 exhibition, Harlem on My Mind, the Cultural Capital of Black America, 1900 to 1968. The BECC raised public awareness of discriminatory practices in the art world through public demonstrations and meetings, as well as behind-the-scenes negotiations with art institutions. The group first met in Andrews' studio in January 1969. As a co-founder of the BECC and one of its main voices, Andrews took an active role in the organization's activities. He and others had begun negotiations with the Whitney Museum in 1969 behind closed doors about an exhibition that would begin to correct those discriminatory practices against artists of African descent. Over a dozen artists, including Andrews, ended up withdrawing from the resulting 1971 exhibition, which was called Contemporary Black Artists in America. When it became clear that although the Whitney Museum would exhibit work by Black artists, they would not seek the expertise of African-American curators or cultural institutions. The press conference announcing the BECC's boycott of the show was held at the Studio Museum the day before the exhibition opening. I'm showing you here 3 images. The first on the left is of Andrews protesting the exhibition, Contemporary Black Artists in America, outside the Whitney in 1971, which is actually the same year he created Trash. And the image on the right is from 2 years earlier and features the artist Norman Lewis picketing outside Harlem on My Mind in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And finally, in the center here, you see a page listing some of the demands of the Art Workers Coalition, which was another artist group that Andrews was very active in, whose principal aim was to put pressure on New York City museums, this time originating with a protest against the Museum of Modern Art, to acknowledge artists' rights and to implement various economic reforms. The demands listed here relate directly to the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met and include, as we see here, canceling the exhibition, hiring Black curatorial and senior staff, and working with the Black community. This commitment to dismantling exclusionary art practices within institutions and elevating the work of Black artists was directly tied to the work being done nationally to advance civil rights for all. So Andrews' role in advocating for change really cannot be understated or underemphasized, as the late Congressman John Lewis, whom we actually just lost this past summer, once wrote about Andrews, quote, his empathy and affinity for the defenseless, based on his own experience on the margins of life, allowed him to share the pain of injustice, to comment on the weaknesses of our democracy and challenge us to change. This is the Benny Andrews you are introduced to. The Black man, the American, the citizen of the world who was deeply troubled by aspects of the human condition, end quote. Lewis, a civil rights icon, was also the son of sharecroppers in the South. So he and Andrews felt a kinship for one another based on their shared experiences growing up. You see here a photograph taken in John Lewis's home that gives a sense of the relationship he had with Andrews. Lewis and Andrews' mom, Viola Andrews, whom we'll see more of later and for whom many Wichita residents are familiar with, share a laugh while Andrews chats with Julian Bond, another civil rights leader. That line that can sometimes exist between art and society, art and politics, is clearly not visible here, a point that is further exemplified by Lewis, who said, quote, Benny was influenced by talent that bridged artistic excellence with social commentary. He began to apply the lessons of civil rights activism to the demand for fair treatment by museums and galleries. For Benny, there was no line between where his activism ended and his art began. To him, using his brush and his pen to capture the essence and spirit of his time was as much an act of protest as sitting in or sitting down was for me, end quote. We'll need to keep this idea of the relationship between art and activism in mind when we look at some more of Andrews's work. So here I'm just showing you again, trash as a visual reminder of the full painting before I spend some time concentrating specifically on the right half of the work. So those 6 panels that you see on the screen on the right. I'm going to discuss what I see as a symbolism and thematic resonance within Andrews's larger practice in each of the 3 men pulling this caravan of what Andrews saw as the US's trash, basically, to the dump. The activists cleverly divided this painting in half, making the right side sparser in composition so as to focus our attention on the men and their incredible uncelebrated labor. The man to the far right, the largest figure in the work, who takes up nearly a quarter of the composition, represents for me a sort of everyman. With his striped t-shirt and jeans, he could be everyone and anyone, especially given that his head is tilted up so as to make his facial features less distinguishable. The man so very obviously strains and labors to pull this caravan. His whole body is tilted back, his arms are taut, and his face is pulled into a grimace of pain. Andrews here acknowledges the labor performed by this unnamed man, a symbol of the labor performed by countless African Americans to build and sustain this country for more than 2 centuries, but also a reminder of the labor often left to people of color to clean up the messes, in this painting, the trash of society, perpetrated by others. Now, this is the part where a Zoom talk falls a little bit short. Andrews's paintings are so incredibly rich because he often incorporates roughly collaged materials to the surfaces. The collaged materials, usually fabrics, create a tactile quality to the work, ranging from low relief-like surfaces to built up more 3-dimensional details. For Andrews, collage became a medium through which he was able to unite his social activism with his aesthetic concerns. He developed his collage technique in the 1950s, around the same time Robert Rauschenberg began creating his combines, a series of freestanding and wall-hung works that used painting, collage, and assemblage. Rauschenberg's 1959 statement about painting was certainly applicable to how Andrews viewed his own practice. He said, quote, "Painting relates to both art and life. Neither can be made. I try to act in that gap between the two," end quote. Andrews embarked in collage at a time when abstraction was prevalent and abstract expressionism was a dominant art movement, and he committed to it and figuration for the rest of his career. Collage allowed Andrews a sense of aesthetic freedom, a move away from what he saw as the limitations of the traditional academic associations of oil painting. It also allowed him to incorporate elements of the people he sought to portray, their clothing, their home furnishings, and other textiles, literally becoming part of the paintings as a way to acknowledge and celebrate their lives. You perhaps can hopefully see here in this detail, but the man's jeans are actually partially constructed from real denim jeans, adhered to the surface of the canvas with glue and paint. As Andrew stated in a 1975 interview, quote, "I always have a need to express myself about people. I've always needed contact with what I call real people, those who have reason to struggle. I am talking about the inherent human need to survive, ethnically, culturally, morally. This is what I need to put on the canvas," end quote. By using clothes and other materials in his paintings, Andrew shatters the division between art and life, and perhaps more importantly, subject and viewer. The jeans, roughly worked over with paint, are familiar and hints at a life of use, and remind the viewer of the humanness of the subject. By offering elements taken from real people, Andrews invites viewers to find points of similarity with his subjects, making his figures relatable and relevant, and thereby enhancing the power of the content in the paintings. We'll return to the importance of collage later on, but for now I want to turn back to the role of labor and Andrews' deep respect for and acknowledgement of the labor performed by others. So in this work that's currently on view at the museum in the exhibition African American Art in the 20th Century, Harlem Renaissance, Civil Rights Era, and Beyond, Andrews draws attention once again to the unnamed laborer, this time the farm worker or sharecropper. Andrews grew up in the segregated American South in Plainview, Georgia, which was a farming community close to Madison. As many African American children did at the time, he grew up helping his parents in the fields. Those memories of his childhood actually spurred Andrews to return to rural Georgia with the assistance of a John Hay Whitney Fellowship in the mid-1960s. He created his autobiographical series from that trip, a group of works that pictured, celebrated, heroicized, and complicated understandings of African American life in the South. Here, as the Smithsonian American Art Museum has stated, the low vantage point we see in the painting can be understood as the perspective of a child, perhaps a direct memory of a young Andrews working in the fields behind his parents. The vantage point also ensures that the figures fill the picture plane, dwarfing the crops on either side. And the crops here look very much like trees, which only increases our perception of the outsized scale of the figure. Set against a clear blue sky with nothing to disturb our view of her, the figure, even with her back turned to the viewer, is heroic, emphasizing the hard work, determination, and steadfastness of sharecroppers and African Americans as a whole. Like the tilted head of the man in jeans and trash, the fact that this figure's head is not shown allows us to imagine ourselves or people we know in her place, at the same time as it points to the thousands, millions of unnamed, unidentified laborers, sharecroppers, and enslaved peoples that have lived in and contributed to this country. Even though Andrews left Georgia as a young adult, he never forgot his Southern roots and continued to pay homage to the people and landscapes of his childhood. He understood deeply and personally the disparities that existed between Black and white communities. And he experienced it from the perspective of both a rural Southerner and a New Yorker, what one would assume would be vastly different, but were in actuality alarmingly similar. You'll have to bear with me as this is a bit of a long quote, but I'm returning to John Lewis, who really described that dual understanding of self and the search for a better life. He said in relating his and Andrews's similar upbringing and drive, quote, "We grabbed every ounce of courage we could gather to heed our inner guidance and follow the insistent tap, tap, tapping of our hearts. It directed us to throw down the plow and the pick, to walk off the fields away from the farm and find our way to the teeming cities. We knew somehow, somewhere, there had to be a better life, and we kept on making ground until we found ourselves in the midst of a revolution. Andrews's dream led him to pick up a brush and palette of paints and become a voice for equal justice for underrepresented artists. Mine led me to sit in and sit down and become a voice for equal justice for segregated citizens," end quote. In returning to images of the South and works made throughout his career, Andrews continued to shed light on the historical and continued treatment of a large population of African Americans in this country. While his activism brought about real change for artists and people of color in New York City in his present and also for the future. The artist Elizabeth Colomba has spoken about how she often strives to tell a complete story within a work, which she accomplishes by ensuring every figure and detail adds to the overall understanding and purpose. Andrews's practice is very different from Colomba's, but I'm interested in this idea of telling a complete story with one canvas, one scene. This work, titled Where All the Rows Meet, and in the Wichita Art Museum's collection, tells us a story, but I think deliberately not a complete one, or at least one that the artist wants the viewer to immediately understand. Instead, Andrews portrays a scene for the viewer to puzzle out, perhaps without resolution. He offers us details within the composition and title that lead to more questions than answers. What is the figure looking at? What are these rows of plants? Where do they meet? Why? I'm intrigued by this sole gangly daisy rising up amidst a sea of tiny red flowers or plants. And like both this outlier flower and the lone figure here, we're left a bit perplexed. And the feeling of wanting to know lingers, exactly as I imagine Andrews intended. There is no pat or easy interpretation of the painting. The artist leaves us a bit uncomfortable and leaves us to reckon with that discomfort. Andrews often placed figures off-center within a blank or white background, a compositional device he used to great effect throughout his career. These minimal compositions, such as you see here, allow for the focus to remain largely on the figure, eliminating the necessity for supporting objects and details in understanding the artist's intended narrative. With just a lone figure and a succinct or pithy title, Andrews directs the viewer's attention to each work's content, asking us to look closely and think deeply about the work. Here, the artist offers us a side view of a farmer who gazes into an unseen distance. He uses the blank white paper to emphasize, perhaps, a host of things: the vastness of the land, the uncertainty of the present and future, and even the loneliness or aloneness of the figure. Andrews also uses the white paper as skin, here drawing in just the barest outline of the figure's face to give us a sense of who he might be. The oversized ears and fleshy jowl suggest a caricatured representation of perhaps the rich white landowner looking over all he owns. With only a thin line separating the whites of the man's lower face and from the white of the background, the work effectively almost removes the divide between man and setting, between man and world. Unlike the previous work, which we see again here on the right, there isn't a sense of heroicizing the lone figure, even though the compositions on the surface are quite similar, with a single figure set within rows of crops. The lone figure here in Where All the Rows Meet is idle, while the figure on the right is bent over in work. The starkness of the white expanse seems more bleak than celebratory, like the sky blue of the long rows. There's a sense of desolation here, or loss, and perhaps it's that gangly daisy or those tiny plants that will soon, hopefully, grow that hints at a future, at the power of the earth, of working the soil, of labor. I'm returning once again to Trash to discuss the second of the three Black men in the work in relation to Andrews's activism outside of the art world and his commitment to education. As I mentioned, the painting speaks to Andrews's frustration with the state of the nation and has as much to do with the contemporary moment as it does the historical exclusion of African-American contributions from the larger narrative of US history. In addition to his work advocating for equity in the art world, Andrews was also deeply committed to justice within the prison system and to educational opportunities for communities of color. The Attica Prison Rebellion, the best known and most significant uprising for better living conditions in US prisons, occurred in September 1971. It's telling then that Andrews incorporated this central figure in the painting, a man in black and white striped pants, reminiscent of a prison uniform, dragging the caravan by a chain wrapped around his ankle. With this one figure, Andrews speaks to and opens up a conversation about the prison system and alludes to the long history of unjustly incarcerated and enslaved peoples. Andrews had started teaching art classes at the Manhattan Detention Complex, known colloquially as the Tombs, in 1971, the same year as Trash and the Attica Rebellion, as part of a major art program in prisons initiated by the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition. By the end of the 1960s, the Tombs had been ranked as the worst of New York City's jails, both in overall conditions and overcrowding, and tensions over conditions, as well as the treatment of the population of color, resulted in two uprisings in 1970. The prison was actually eventually closed from 1974 until 1983 as a result of the recognition of its horrific, inhumane conditions. This figure in Trash, then, is Andrews' statement on incarceration, and one based on real experience from within. Unlike the two other men, the figure appears to have an uphill climb, seen in the almost perpendicular bent of his torso and head, and the swinging of his arms with clenched fists, hinting at the additional struggles he faces as an incarcerated man. This representation, however, is not a simple condemnation of the prison system. Instead, it's an invitation to think deeply about society and to make change for ourselves. The art program in prison, started by the BECC, expanded throughout the United States, offering opportunities for engagement with the arts to thousands of incarcerated people. The city of New York and then Mayor John Lindsay recognized Andrews for his work in prisons in 1973, just 3 years after the start of the program, suggesting again that an invitation, a willingness to engage, can have a profound effect. In 1976, Andrews organized an exhibition of artwork by participants in the BECC's prison art program, which he called Echoes, Prisons USA, And you see the cover of the brochure here. Andrews starts his introduction to the brochure with, quote, "The experience of being in prison is often one of dying, mentally, physically, or both. Art is one of the means many prisoners have found to express their will to survive and to attempt to communicate with themselves and with those of us on the outside," end quote. And he poignantly concludes with, quote, "Echoes from another America, ours," end quote. In this short text, written not as an artist, but as an activist, Andrews implicates, invites, entangles us all collectively in society's complicity in the prison system. However, he also affirmed the power of art in bringing hope and the possibility of change. Andrews's commitment to disenfranchised and at-risk populations extended beyond the prison system as well. In 1976, he also became the art program director for the Inner City Roundtable of Youth, an organization made up of thousands of young people who were part of over 50 New York City gangs. Members from often rival gangs would set aside their differences to cooperate on the program's projects, which included a patrol and escort service for the elderly and a housing renovation program to strengthen their communities in the hopes of reducing overall violence. The image you see here shows Andrews in his role as art program director, organizing a youth day with artwork installed at the state office building in Harlem. Prior to this work and his work in the BECC's prison art program, Andrews taught art at varied locations, including in the South Bronx and at the New School for Social Research in New York, and the Jewish Community Center in Bayonne, New Jersey. In 1968, he started teaching at Queens College in the SEEK program, a state-funded program still in existence today that offers support services for economically disadvantaged and academically underserved students, and continued as an instructor there for the next 3 decades. Collectively, Andrews's commitment to education, and art education specifically, speaks to his belief in equal opportunities and social justice for all, and a belief he upheld and practiced throughout his career. And finally, in discussing the final male figure in Trash somewhat briefly, I'm returning to some points I made earlier. You can see here that the entire head of this central figure is delineated only by an oval void. Similar to his technique of keeping large areas of his backgrounds untouched, as we saw in Where All the Rows Meet, Andrews's deliberate use of the blank or white canvas in place of the body allowed him to, quote, deal more with the unsaid, end quote. In these works, the artist again invites the viewer's active participation in understanding and constructing the meaning of the work, encouraging a consideration of the depicted figure as someone or everyone. By leaving the face here completely blank, in fact, emphasizing its incompleteness with an almost perfect empty circle, Andrews asks us to consider what remains unspoken, unsaid, unconsidered. He leaves it to the viewer to also fill in the blank, inserting their own face or those of others into the circle, thereby assuming the burden that this figure carries and strains to pull. I want to quickly just show you again another detail so you can see his incorporation of collage. For Lowry Stokes Sims, quote, Andrews did not simply cut and apply cloth. He relied on its texture and pattern to function within the composition, to provoke responses and to convey meaning, end quote. The use of fabric here, combined with the deliberately unfinished, sketchy rendering of the figure's limbs, adds, quote, a powerful psychological aura, end quote, as the viewer imagines both the life this man has led and continues to struggle with, as well as the process of this figure in the making, a suggestion that perhaps he has yet to be fully realized. These pants, which I hope you can tell, are made up of a thin, creased and rumpled brown material that recalls the dirt and soil of a past rural life, add an emotional weight to our understanding of the figure. This practice of leaving portions of the figure's face vacant can be found in other works by Andrews, which you can see 2 examples of here. As I've written about previously in Afro-American on the left here, the face of an unidentified Black man sits against a white background. Andrews depicts the man with general features, but deliberately leaves aspects of his face, including his eyes, nose, cheek, and large expanse of forehead, blank, rendered only by a shaped and cut primed canvas that was glued onto the canvas support. In doing so, the artist invites us to challenge our previously held assumptions of what it means to be Afro-American. The emphasis on the forehead here is particularly interesting, as a large blank area calls attention to intellect and the brain. It's probably impossible to tell here, but trust me when I say that Andrews's use of cut canvas collaged onto the canvas board to delineate that forehead creates a slight and very subtle three-dimensional surface, further calling attention to that area. In The Blacksmith, the image on the right, Andrews similarly renders the head and the dome of the head with adhered canvas in a color that almost, but not quite, matches the background. The precision with which he's represented other details, the blacksmith's apron and tools, the solid wood table, bring the figure to life and honor him. Here again, Andrews ennobles the everyday person, elevating what is normally seen as a humble profession to one that warrants a life-size portrait. And this work is actually 82 inches high, so really, truly life-size. Andrews was faithful to figurative works such as this because they had the potential to impact audiences in real ways, offering viewers representations of themselves and others that both empower and celebrate, as we see here, and question and challenge, as we've seen in other works. Additionally, he is someone who understands the full gravity of depicting the Black figure. The artist Fred Wilson has suggested when discussing a self-portrait by Andrews, quote, making and remaking oneself and revealing to the world all that you see that is unspoken or unjust is one of the greatest contributions an artist can make, end quote. Andrews here takes what is unspoken and uncelebrated and brings it to the fore. And he does it with care. His works simultaneously interrogate and demonstrate the underlying power that comes with representing the body and the deep responsibility that comes with depicting the Black body. Andrews was always conscious, deliberately, meticulously so, of the politics around figuration. And that's why his commitment to it throughout his career aligns so closely with his dedication to social justice and the advocacy of the visibility of people of color. As we've seen so far, Andrews' figures hold space. They demand visibility. Their features and composition anchoring an understanding of lived experiences and the larger human condition. Even in ink drawings such as this one in the Wichita Art Museum's collection, where the figures are delineated only with just the barest of lines, Andrews brings life and personality to his figures. As Lowry Stokes Sims has noted, quote, Andrews' on-scene memories become recollections of intensely felt encounters with the human spirit in both its fragility and strength. His use of elongated forms and gestures add energy and humor to scenes of high contemplation and reflection, and make the stoic figures less anonymous, end quote. These elongated forms and gestures are certainly visible here, particularly in the limbs of the central figure. The work isn't a dispassionate or academic rendering of a figure, and it's certainly not really anatomically correct. Yet it's full of life. We get a real sense of the figure's personality. And even though Andrews has provided us with just the barest of details, I don't know if you can notice, but there's actually no pool table here. He hasn't drawn one in. He allows us to fill in the blanks, or perhaps our mind automatically fills in those blanks because of all the ways in which we are engaged with the work. Andrews uses the simple medium of ink on paper to create figures that are human, that make us curious to learn more about who they are. He elevates the common person, such as this pool player, and their everyday lives, portraying them as noble, quote, no matter how humble the chore or activity, end quote. And what makes his artistic practice overall so important is that his commitment to figuration ran alongside a dedication to aesthetic integrity and innovation. Andrews was constantly developing his practice, experimenting while delving deeply into the forms he knew. And we see that particularly in this next work. As I mentioned earlier, he created hundreds of pen and ink sketches and oil studies during the 6-year period he worked on the Bicentennial series. And here you see one of the oil studies for Trash, which features a remarkably different scene than the monumental painting. I bring this up because not only did Andrews often work in series form, spending time focusing in on one theme and creating a whole body of work around that theme, but he also returned to subjects over and over again, sometimes over a number of years, and used sketches and studies truly as a way to work through various ideas. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing this process and the resulting works, because I think it sheds light on Andrews' commitment, not only to his artistic practice, but also to his work as an educator and activist. So here, just showing you those two works side by side as a visual reminder of the pretty stark differences between them. And then honing in on some details here, so you can see again the quality of the materials and what he's using in terms of collage in order to really evoke a sense of the figures, right? So we feel as if we are involved in this scene. We feel as if we are placed deliberately into that scene. The texture and tactility of the collage materials remind us that these fabrics came from someone, that they have a history, that they have a life of being worn and touched and used. The viewer then, placed within this crowd, is invited to reflect on their own associations with these materials, their own memories. We become a spectator, but also perhaps a participant in the scene. Like Charles Wilson Peete unveiling his museum in the 1822 painting, The Artist in His Museum, which you see here on the right, two men in the oil study pull back the curtains in front of figures in the foreground to reveal a strange sight, a mass of people gathered around the blue orb, an approximation of the Earth with the United States the only visible landmass. Sitting atop the orb is a familiar figure, a young blonde woman in an American flag dress holding a torch, while three Black men pull this unseen object across the country. The central scene, with several modifications, is the only compositional feature in common with trash. And I think it demonstrates the depth of Andrews's artistic inquiry. He deliberately framed the composition in this study as a stage set, setting the scene for the curtain to be drawn back to reveal a spectacular, entertaining sight. There's a way in which that central scene, spotlit and with seemingly hundreds of people engrossed with it, is for display to be consumed by us, the viewer. Having both trash and this oil study, as well as several pen and ink studies in the Studio Museum's collection, has been an incredible learning experience for me because they've made me so curious about his artistic process. What decisions, thoughts, ideas led from one sketch to another? Why did a composition worked through across several studies suddenly change? And so I returned to Lady Liberty because in just these three works alone, you can see the artist at work. We see here in the pen and ink, on paper, those three men, those three male figures, go from being crucified around the earth, as we see in the drawing, to pulling that unseen caravan, which we see in the center image, that oil study, which is then what is included in the final monumental painting. What remains constant across all three works is Lady Liberty perched high atop something, and the androgynous headless figures, which were referenced the Vietnam War, that sit below. What I find so interesting about the shift in composition in these works is that the oil study so deliberately set the stage, literally, for the focus to be on that central scene that you see at center here. In the final painting, however, Andrews pulls out those three male figures who appeared more as supporting characters in these previous studies so that they become the focus, painting them on a monumental scale. I read this change as critically tied to Andrews's commitment to the Black subject, to ennobling these everyday figures, while also calling attention to the substantial inequalities that existed for them. For the artist who thought of himself as a, quote, people's painter, this prominent modification to the composition was probably a natural part of the process of getting to the final painting. I focus on this aspect of his career mostly because I find it so fascinating and so rare that we get to see an artist consistently work through his ideas in such a purposeful manner. And so I'm turning to a work in the museum's collection, Viola Andrews. Andrews returned to his mother as subject, as well as his father, whom, as Tara mentioned, was also an artist, a number of times over the years. And what I love about these works collectively is that Andrews represents different aspects of his mother's personality in each work so that the viewer gains a sense of her in the round. Here we have a poised, graceful elder. Her black dress and hat, both rendered using paint and collaged fabric, lend a solemnity to the figure in somewhat sharp contrast to the riot of colors in the background. She sits in a traditional three-quarter pose, but fully engages the viewer, soberly staring back at us with calm dignity. We've interrupted her in the middle of reading, hinting perhaps at the fact that Andrews always credited his mother for being such a strong advocate for education, ensuring that he became the first in his family to finish high school at a time when most children of sharecroppers, by necessity, had to drop out of school in order to help in the fields. The painting as a whole relays the important relationship between subject and artist, and we can see the deep respect that Andrews has for his subject, his mother. So throughout his works, Andrews smartly interrogates portraiture as a genre, breaking down some of its longstanding tropes and bringing to the fore everyday people and spaces. So for Andrews to take on the subject of the artist's mother was for him to confront a whole history of this subfield of the genre. And I'm showing you just two examples here with paintings by Rembrandt on the left and Van Gogh on the right. Like his practice as a whole, Andrews directly tackles the question of who is being worthy of being represented, of being acknowledged by the larger society and by history. By inserting portraits of his mother into this conversation, by in fact insisting on her presence, Andrews makes space for people of color within the art historical canon. And then just one final example, I imagine that Andrews was well aware of Whistler's famous 1871 painting, Arrangement in Gray and Black #1, or what is more commonly known as Portrait of the Artist's Mother or Whistler's Mother, which you can see on the right here. Whistler, over 100 years earlier, was radically challenging some of the tropes that existed in his own time, seen here most significantly and suggesting that a portrait of his mother could be reduced to an arrangement of black and gray. Andrews, on the other hand, is perhaps nodding to Whistler's painting by asserting his mother's presence in his work. She is not simply a subject, but a person to be engaged with, to understand. These two drawings, completed the same year as the painting in the museum's collection, show a more humorous side to both the artist and his subject. Andrews brings unique insight into the vast emotional landscape of his subjects. In all three works, Viola Andrews, in a dress and hat, sits on a chair with a book in her lap. However, Andrews has presented us with three very different women, demonstrating a depth of personality not seen in historical depictions of people of African descent, but that which enables the viewer to feel closer to the subject, Andrews's mother. The woman on the left slouches with pigeon toes and a fun but maybe somewhat ridiculous pom-pommed hat. Her face is heavily lined, looking down at her lap. The woman on the right seems to be glaring at us and fed up or not interested at all in us. Both depictions, which are more caricature in style, as Andrews's drawings typically were, are a far cry from the dignified portrayal in the painting, but they give us a peek into the artist's working process. So here I'm showing you the painting and one of the drawings side by side. You'll note that Viola Andrews in the drawing wears the same outfit as in the painting, and that the chair appears to be the same. You can actually, or I can actually imagine that Viola Andrews gave her son, Benny Andrews, that annoyed look that we see in the drawing after perhaps spending a long time stiffly posing. So we really think about the artist and his process of working in these collective works. Here, just two more portraits of Viola Andrews completed several years before and after the work in the museum's collection. We see again different aspects of her personality. On the left, a hardworking sharecropper with a cotton plant in the lower left corner. And on the right, a church-going woman who teaches Sunday school. Andrews, in all of these works, as you may have noticed, names his mother fully in the titles, something that many artists don't do, instead identifying the subject only as the artist's mother. By naming his mother over and over again, Andrews demands recognition of her, demands that her name be preserved for history, which not only suggests his deep and abiding respect for her, but also his own keen understanding that he had to be responsible for his own legacy and for the legacies of those he cared about. With the lived experiences of so many people of color lost to history, Andrews took the responsibility of constructing an archive seriously. He preserved, acknowledged, and challenged history in his works, but also in his meticulous archiving of self, his personal life and artistic practice, the larger art world, particularly with respect to artists of African descent, and the programs and initiatives he supported and took an active role in. Andrews' dedication to figuration, steadfastly honed over 50 years, is not unusual then given his commitment to social justice. As Lowry Stokes Sims has written, Andrews, quote, conveyed to the viewer that although the figures in his work were not exactly portraits, they were definitely real people with histories that would talk to him, end quote. By picturing these people and their histories, he figured them into the narrative, ensuring that they would be part of future conversations and the longer arc of art history. In insisting on reflecting and picturing the lived experiences of his figures, whether real or imagined, Andrews brings a visible compassion and empathy to his practice, an oftentimes rather rare quality among artists. I'm going to end with this painting, Portrait of the Black Madonna, currently on view at the museum, because it so beautifully encapsulates much of what I've discussed. Its composition is actually quite similar to the portrait of Viola Andrews in the museum's collection. We have a seated woman with hands in her lap that fills the left half of the canvas, while a vase of flowers atop a wood table is on the right half. While simple, it adeptly relays Andrews's intention. And like the Viola Andrews portrait, this work celebrates motherhood, and specifically Black motherhood. When we think of Madonnas, we think of depictions of the Virgin Mary, perhaps the most iconic representation of the mother figure in the Western world. Naming this woman as the Black Madonna was a very conscious choice, one that places Black women as central. For Andrews, who dedicated his entire career as an artist, educator, and activist to raising the visibility of people of color, this representation of Black female strength, resilience, dignity, and beauty brilliantly captures his life's work. Thank you. So that was the end of my talk, and I am eager and willing to answer any questions that you have. I'm not seeing any in the chat thus far.
Hi, Connie, it's Tara. And first of all, we just want to say thank you. This was phenomenal. We have wanted someone to come to the museum to talk about Benny Andrews for the last couple of years. And this was just the perfect moment, and so thrilled with all this close looking of objects that we and the audience can come see, and just beautiful, beautiful, again, looking at those pictures and telling us what we see in them. So that's just could not be more pleased. So thank you so much. And I'll start with the first question, and then we can move to Doug Oliver's question in the chat, which is, can you tell us about at what point in Andrews's career that he started working on such a monumental scale? And was that, I mean, do you relate that to kind of the way in which, so much art of the time, huge abstract expressionist canvases were being made? Or do you think of it more as a kind of nod to the past? So, giant, Van Dyck portraits, or big, 19th century French portraits, or even kind of, WPA murals in the 1930s. What do we think those influences were, and when did that take place?
I think all of those things, honestly. I don't know exactly, what, like when that conscious decision was made. I know that oftentimes he scaled his works based on, what he felt was the import of the subject, right? And so when he was doing the bicentennial series, it was a monumental effort. He spent an entire year working on just through one theme, right? Over and over again, thinking about how he was going to portray a particular subject matter that was important to him. So that year, 1971, he worked on just the theme of trash, but he also did symbols, which you mentioned earlier, Tara, and other sex and three other themes, which I'm not remembering now. And so that's the scale of that large work of trash, the final monumental painting, is 10 feet by 30 feet long. So we're talking about a work that was meant to kind of overwhelm the viewer, right? For us to really feel what Andrews was trying to get across to us, right? Which was involving us wholeheartedly in our own kind of complicity in what he saw as problems, not only in current society, but also in the long arc of US history, right? He was thinking deeply about those 200 years that had passed with the upcoming bicentennial exhibition celebrations, and kind of asking us to question what progress was actually made. And then in thinking about perhaps the blacksmith work that I talked about earlier, that it was 82 inches high, right? So again, that monumentalization of the figure, as you said, Tara, like hinting back at those other large scale works that we see, those portraits, those grandiose portraits that were meant to celebrate, to heroicize, to ennoble the figure. And by deliberately, very consciously choosing a blacksmith or choosing any other type of kind of humble profession to elevate to that scale was a comment on the fact that these people deserved to be pictured, right? They deserved to have a recognition and understanding of their practice because what they were doing was very heroic in a lot of ways. But then on the other hand, what I love about his practice as a whole is that he would change up the scale all the time, right? It's not like he moved permanently to working on a large scale. He would go back to drawings, right? Smaller 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper constantly throughout his practice, or smaller scale oil paintings. And I think that was a way of really thinking through his practice more generally, right? He was working through always a lot of different ideas, focusing on works in series, but also returning to subjects over and over again. And so that all of those ideas collectively made their way into variously sized works, which I find to be just a really interesting aspect of his practice too, in terms of thinking about how an artist considers not only his subject matter, but how he's representing that subject matter. So I'm going to turn maybe to the questions that I see in the chat here. First with Doug Oliver, who asks that he's being curious about recognition of Benny in his home state of Georgia, and if there's any art on display. Yes, totally. The state of Georgia truly does recognize Benny Andrews and his dad as being such a vibrant, artistic legacy and someone that they celebrate throughout. So the High Museum of Art in Atlanta has a number of works in their collection. Other museums also do as well. And Benny returned to Georgia. I think he had actually a house there that he would go to, if I'm remembering correctly, and spent a lot of time there. He gifted works as well from his collection from his personal collection, because he wanted his work to be seen by everyone, right? Even though he spent the majority of his life after leaving Georgia in New York City, it wasn't just about the New York art world, right? It was really about thinking about how to bring art to people all around the country. And so he did spend a lot of time being very deliberate about where his works would end up and would be seen. And so he made a conscious decision and a real conscious effort to gift works of his own and of his father's to smaller institutions around the country to ensure that they had examples of his work, but also that they were seeing kind of some of the subjects and themes that he was working through. Thank you for that question. And then Neva Thiessen asks, so many of the artists' work at the new exhibit at WAM use collage as an artist medium, at least in part. Do you have an idea why? I actually haven't seen the exhibition in person because I am in New York. But in terms of collage, I think we can talk about the longer arc of collage, right, as an artistic medium, and it goes back for decades before Andrews picked it up in the 1950s. But I think primarily a lot of artists were drawn to it because of what Andrews was conveying as well, right? The materials that he was drawn to, and a lot of artists were drawn to, were from real life, right? They were from people. People held them, used them, lived with them. And so to imbue that spirit, that sense of humanness into the work was something that a lot of artists were working through. Speaking about it from perhaps another perspective in terms of artists working in collage, we can think about Romare Bearden, who was a contemporary of Benny Andrews, and they collaborated on a number of kind of larger artistic efforts in New York City. Bearden was another artist who was a social activist as well, but then, and also someone who worked in a figurative tradition. But then in terms of materiality itself, if we think about, again, that same period of time in the 1960s into the 1970s, thinking about artists in LA in particular, Noah Purifoy, John Outerbridge, Betty Saar, David Hammonds, who used the Watts riots in the 1960s as a way to think through incorporating social reality, the lives of African Americans who were significantly impacted by the Watts Rebellion into their own practice. So a lot of those artists were actually taking detritus from the rebellion and using them in sculptures. So again, that sense of the tactile quality of these objects that were used or known to people is something that I think runs throughout this use of not only collage, but assemblage and the use of materials. Terrence Washington, hi Terrence Washington. Where did Andrews get his fabrics? So from what I understand, and this is speaking briefly with his widow, Neen Humphrey, who's also an artist, he got them from a variety of sources, including kind of just permanently borrowing them from people's closets, including his family members. And I think that, really does speak to his insistence on using fabrics that were worn, right? That had a life to them, that held onto the histories of the people that wore them. Obviously, he would shape them and change them. He oftentimes, as you saw, painted over them, he tore them up, etc. But he was really drawn to that quality of being lived in and having a life, holding onto a life that existed outside of the artwork. I didn't show you an example or a detail of trash, which is on the left side of the canvas, but he actually incorporates an entire sofa cushion that's pasted, literally pasted, oftentimes using Elmer's glue, onto the surface of that canvas. And so again, thinking about, it's not just clothing that he's using, but he's really using items that come from the home as a way to really think about like the seeped in histories of the people who used these fabrics and textiles on an everyday basis.
Well, Connie, if there aren't any other questions, again, I just have to say thank you again. We all have so much to think about and look for when we look at the show, and so we just thank you so much. And next time in Wichita, okay, we'll get you here when COVID is over.
I'm holding you to taking me to all the restaurants.
Okay, we'll eat our way through town. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.